4 weeks into the US-Israeli war on Iran, tensions between Israel and Lebanon have escalated, with numerous airstrikes and rocket attacks leaving a trail of destruction and displacement. The conflict has pushed Lebanon's population to the brink, with many residents struggling to access basic necessities like food, water, and medical care due to the ongoing violence. The situation in Lebanon is dire, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and thousands of homes left uninhabitable. The war has also disrupted the country's already fragile infrastructure, leaving many without electricity or running water. The international community has been criticized for its slow response to the crisis, with many calling for greater action to be taken to alleviate the suffering of Lebanon's civilian population. Looking ahead, it is crucial that the international community takes immediate and decisive action to address the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Lebanon and works towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict. A 32-year-old man lost their lives in police custody in Bahrain, sparking outrage among human rights activists and opposition groups. The detainee, who had been arrested for expressing anti-war sentiments against the conflict with Iran, lost his life while being held by authorities. This incident has raised concerns about the treatment of protesters and critics in Bahrain, where dissent is often met with repression. Rights groups are calling for an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the man's death, highlighting the need for greater transparency and accountability within the country's security forces. Looking ahead, it remains to be seen how the government will respond to these calls for reform. But one thing is clear: the international community will be watching Bahrain's actions closely in the coming days. In the early hours of September 17, a U.S. drone strike lost their lives top Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, sparking a wave of retaliation from Tehran. The attack, which marked the beginning of the US-Israel war on Iran, unfolded over 4 weeks of escalating tensions between the two nations and their regional allies. The conflict began with the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, who was seen as a key figure in Iran's nuclear program. In response, Iran launched ballistic missile strikes on Israeli targets, including a major air base used by the U.S. military. The U.S. responded with airstrikes on Iranian military sites, while Israel carried out targeted killings of Iranian commanders and their proxies in Syria. The war on Iran has significant implications for global energy markets and geopolitics, as the two nations vie for influence in the Middle East. The conflict also raises concerns about the potential for a wider regional war and its impact on global stability. Nepal's former Prime Minister KP Oli was arrested yesterday on charges related to the fatal crackdown on a deadly protest that occurred in November last year, resulting in over 70 deaths and widespread unrest. The protests were sparked by Oli's government's handling of the country's economy and COVID-19 response, with demonstrators demanding greater transparency and accountability. The events leading up to the arrest were part of a broader crisis that has plagued Nepal for months, with ongoing protests and strikes affecting various sectors of society. The government's efforts to quell the unrest have been met with resistance, with many calling for Oli's resignation and an independent investigation into the handling of the protests. Looking ahead, the arrest of KP Oli raises questions about accountability and the rule of law in Nepal, particularly in the face of widespread public discontent. The international community will be watching closely to see how this development unfolds and whether it marks a turning point in the country's efforts to address its deep-seated economic and social challenges. BBC Russian has been under attack for decades, first by jamming broadcasts and now by having its website blocked in Russia. The British broadcaster's efforts to reach Russian-speaking audiences have been a source of defiance against Soviet and later Russian censorship since the 1930s. For years, BBC Russian had to contend with Soviet jamming signals that disrupted its broadcasts, but even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the service continued to face obstacles. In recent years, Russia has taken steps to limit access to foreign media outlets, including blocking BBC Russian's website in 2022. Despite these efforts, millions of people still rely on BBC Russian for news and information, with many using VPNs or other workarounds to circumvent the block. The service remains a vital lifeline for those seeking independent journalism and uncensored voices in Russia. Looking ahead, it will be interesting to see how the situation unfolds as the international community responds to Russia's efforts to restrict access to foreign media. African and Caribbean nations have voted at the United Nations for countries that once benefited from slavery to provide reparations, sparking a complex and contentious debate about historical injustices. The resolution, which passed with 64 votes in favor, 56 against, and 73 abstentions, calls on states to acknowledge the historical injustice of slavery and take steps towards redress. This move comes after years of advocacy from descendants of enslaved people, who argue that compensation is long overdue for the centuries-long exploitation. The UN's decision has significant implications for countries like the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands, which were major colonial powers during the transatlantic slave trade. Looking ahead, it remains to be seen how these nations will respond to the UN's call for reparations, and whether this vote marks a turning point in the global conversation about historical injustices.